Okay, so we're in Derech Hashem, not Derech Hashem, sorry, we're Daas Tevunos, and this part of the Sefer we're talking about Hashem's attribute of judgment, how God judges all, rewards those that do well, do good things, and punishes those who don't do good things. And we're on Kuf Lamed Tes 139, page 384 in the bilingual edition. So he says he wants to give an introduction. So he's actually not going to start talking about the judgment yet, but he's going to give an introduction, kind of a philosophical introduction to this topic. So if it's a little bit, it might be for us, I think it might be a little vague, but we'll try our best to understand it. Amr HaNeshama Emor. The Neshama tells the Seichel, please explain. Say what you're going to tell me. Amr HaSeichel. Harav HaGadol HaRambam Nis'ar Al Tar Yalod. The Rambam in Mor Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed, speaks about what the word Yalod means, to be born. Hanimtza B'Ksuvim, we find the word in Tanakh. Na'etak L'Dvar M'Sher Ein Haleid B'Hem Yuchedes. V'Amar Zal. The Rambam says we find many times. This is a good principle to know, actually, in general, that the Rambam is defining here sometimes when the Torah uses language as a metaphor, right? Because he says sometimes we find the word born, and he's going to explain that we see the word born by mountains, but the mountains don't have babies. So what does that mean? So sometimes there's borrowed words used to explain things in Tanakh. Now that doesn't mean that the stories in Tanakh are metaphors. Chas v'shalom. That's not what the Rambam is saying. He's just saying some certain terms are borrowed to mean other things. Yalod hush'alu zos hamila lahima alahamsas hadavar hativim b'terem harim yuladu. Says the word birth is used to mean something, a physical thing coming into being. It says b'terem harim yuladu, before the mountains were born. So birth connotes something coming into reality. Also, it's a term used for thoughts. When your thoughts come into action from background information and those thoughts crystallize, that's also called being born. Kamo vayalad shaker, he gave birth to falsehood. And from this it says, Ubiyalde nachrim yaspiku ad kan lashono. They fill their minds with the offspring of strangers. Okay. This word of birth is used for thoughts. And everything similar to it. Just like the word birth connotes something which is in the thoughts, which can come into being, the potentiality to come out into reality is called, we use the word pregnant. Like the verse says, he became impregnated with iniquity and gave birth to falsehood. So the Ramchal is just explaining the Rambam here that certain words are used, they're borrowed terms, right? When a thought gives birth to something, you're not actually having a baby, you are based on background information and things that were in the background and potentiality that comes in to reality. On every conclusion that someone has, it has to be given birth. A person has a conclusion. Where is that conclusion about anything? Anything that a person concludes in his mind, where does that come from? From certain hanachos, certain first thoughts that he had, certain base assumptions that he had, give birth to those conclusions. When it gives birth, it comes out from the potentiality to the actual. Furthermore, anything that exists, its completeness is something added to the fact that it exists. Meaning, you could find something in the world which is not complete. We find many things that are not complete. He says that the cause, we're talking about potentiality and potential energy, the same potential which brings a being into existence is also the same potential which completes a being. And the last line he said, and this is all obvious for somebody who knows the Zarchei HaChachma. These are very philosophical ideas. And I feel like back in the day people dealt with this much more than we do. But that's the general concept that he's saying so far, is that for something to be complete, And for something to be incomplete, the same cause that brought it into existence in its incomplete form is the cause that will make it into its complete form. You already heard earlier, we talked about earlier a lot how everything in the world is interconnected. All of God's systems for how things operate are interconnected in the spiritual world. We said how just like we have an ecosystem in the physical world where everything is connected and everything depends on each other thing, so too in the spiritual world, right? If all the mosquitoes would die, then that would have a ripple effect affecting all of the ecosystem, eventually affecting even human beings. So too Hashem has an interconnected spiritual system. Excuse me. And they're all connected with one bond. And they have all these, and they're only complete with all of many details. And this is what is dependent, the beauty and the completeness of the world. We explained this earlier. And this gives us a lot of space to contemplate the great depth and wisdom with which Hashem made the world. It's not just Hashem made random things, but rather He made a whole interconnected spiritual ecosystem. So a person could spend a long time trying to figure out as much as he can about this spiritual ecosystem. Now he's going to return back a little bit to what he was just saying. Every hanhaga, action that Hashem does with these hashpos that He has, you should know that there was something that there was this potentiality before it actually came into existence. And this is called the reason in giving birth. It's this reason that gave birth. And this potentiality is what gave birth to something that's going to be born from it. And this is the rule about the systems which I mentioned earlier. That they start from the loftiest place in the heavens and go all the way down to the world. Like we learned earlier, that even the lowliest things in the world are connected to the highest things in the world. Okay, let's just finish a couple more paragraphs. And next week, I promise next week it's going to be more. I know this week is a little vague with all of these kind of philosophical concepts, but he's really giving an introduction. And then next week he's going to get more into how the Midas Hadin, how judgment works. When Hashem makes one of these hashbaz, it doesn't only affect that thing by itself, but also it has the potential to affect many more things. And everything that's going to happen will, in the additional things besides this hashbah, is included in its nature. And if Hashem wants this hashpah that He made to impact the world more, it'll be more defined and delineated. At first, it only had a potential of the initial hashpah, and then it became he redefined it in the world. And even in that you could have with completeness and not completeness. And all of this is obvious to somebody who knows the way of wisdom and the ways of analytical wisdom, he translates it as. So he gives an example. What does he mean that something, Hashem can make a hashpah in the world, and first it comes into existence, but it's not truly defined and delineated. So he gives that example as, in the bottom here, this rabbi, I forgot his name, of the aspect of judgment, that Hashem could bring judgment into the world, but it's not strictly defined yet. So therefore, judgment will even impact the righteous to a certain degree, even though perhaps by the strict letter of the law, they might not deserve it if it was just going with the Midas Hadin. We'll talk more about how that can be. But he's saying that if the Midas Hadin, the attribute of justice, is in the world, but it's not defined the way it should be, it could impact the righteous also. But he says after, when it gets developed, then it would only impact those It would only impact the wicked. And he talks about another example of Hashem's, what does it mean Hashem's emanations having latent potential? So he says also here in the bottom that you could have something in the world that has its latent potential inside of it. He gives an example as a child. A child has the potential to become an adult, even though he's not an adult now. But within that child is all the potential to become an adult. That's the example he gives here on the bottom. Let's just finish this last paragraph here. When we sit and we contemplate Hashem's ways in the world, in His justice, we find a very deep wisdom. And as we learn about it, we'll be able to discover many secrets from the Torah. We'll be able to answer many uncertainties and questions that we've had. That people have these questions who don't know the ways of Hashem. The obvious question, why do good things happen to bad people? Why do the wicked get rewarded? He says, when you understand how Hashem operates these systems, which all of this was an introduction to, you will be able to understand why these things happen. And he says, these are questions that people have who haven't stopped to sit and think about how Hashem operates the world. So that's what the Ramchal, in subsequent chapters, is going to do, explain to us how Hashem operates the world, how He runs the world.
What? To the systems?
Right. So we already learned about Hanhagas HaYichud, which is how Hashem guides the world to its final completion, where we all understand that there's one God, all of humanity, and how all of humanity has a purpose to get to that goal. But now he's going to explain, well, there's also reward and punishment, and that's a separate Hanhagas. So how does that work? And then I believe also he's going to talk about how those two systems operate together. And he says when you understand this, you'll be able to answer many questions that people who haven't learned this have. But this, again, was just a difficult philosophical introduction, which the Ramchal says is very simple for those that know the ways of wisdom, which apparently I am not included in that.
But even angels have